And welcome to the lineup. Today is March 17th, 2022. I'm Barry Stagner, and let me start our evening off by saying a happy St. Patrick's Day to all the Irish out there. And I think it's a pretty timely reminder for us that, God works all things together for good. And St. Patrick in the 5th century AD was captured by pirates and sold into slavery into Ireland. And he, sometime later, was able to escape, and he went back and became a bishop, and then returned to the very place where something awful had happened to him, and he became the patron saint of Ireland. So, listen, God does work all things together for good, including our tough situations, and boy, our world is in one now. And yet we have the opportunity to understand these things, knowing that God has revealed them all in advance because he sits over the circle of the earth. He sits on high. He knows all things. The past and the future are the same to him because he can see them both fully, and he has disclosed to us what is happening in these last days. And nothing is a surprise to him, including the individual things that come our way. And he's faithful to us in the midst and through them. And I think St. Patrick is a great example of taking something awful and turning it into something wonderful that blesses other people. Now, we've got something awful going on in our world, and there's no shortage of news regarding the continuation of the Russian aggression on the Ukrainian people. And our first story comes from a couple of days ago, and that which happened, which is a bit of a rarity here in the U.S., and that is the Ukrainian President Zelensky addressed the U.S. Congress via Zoom. And Ukrainian President Zelensky, according to the Al Jazeera report, asked U.S. Congress to help protect our skies. And President Volodymyr Zelensky on Wednesday urged the U.S. Congress to provide more weapons to help his country fight off Russian airstrikes in an invasion that has brought death and destruction and unleashed a wave of refugees. Some say there's been some 3 million who have fled Ukraine. Reacting to concerns by President Joe Biden and many U.S. lawmakers that imposing a no-fly zone could escalate the conflict with nuclear-armed Russia, Zelensky asked for more planes and air defense systems. Russia has turned the Ukrainian sky into a source of death, he told a meeting of the U.S. House of Representatives and Senate. I need to protect our skies. And Zelensky's virtual address came a day after he made a plea to Canada's parliament for more Western sanctions on Russia and the imposition of a no-fly zone over Ukraine amid a conflict that began with Russia's February 24th invasion. And Biden signed a law on Tuesday allowing $13.6 billion in emergency aid to Ukraine to help it obtain more weaponry and for humanitarian assistance. Biden was expected to announce an additional $800 million in security assistance to Ukraine later on Wednesday in remarks on U.S. aid to the country, a White House official reported. Zelensky has sought in recent weeks to shore up support for his country in various speeches to foreign audiences, including the European Parliament and the British Parliament. Support for Ukraine is a rare instance in which Republicans and Democrats have aligned in a sharply divided Congress, with some lawmakers in both parties urging Biden to go further in helping Ukraine. There is some bipartisan support in Congress for rushing combat aircraft to Ukraine. And on Tuesday, the U.S. Senate unanimously passed a resolution condemning Russian President Vladimir Putin as a war criminal. Putin responded, and the Kremlin responded that this is unthinkable and unforgivable. Now, one of the things I think we need to recognize about the institution of a no-fly zone, an internationally recognized institution of a no-fly zone, that would mean that any violation by Russian aircraft would be any intrusion of Russian aircraft on the no-fly zone or over Ukraine would create an international incident, and international forces would have the right under this no-fly zone to respond, drawing the rest of the world into this conflict. And that's why there is the hesitation, right or wrong. Those are the facts, and that is why the U.S. has not imposed this no-fly zone or agreed to this continual demand that has been made from the Ukrainian president. The Times of Israel is reporting that Russia says there's hope for a compromise as fighting intensifies in Kiev's suburbs. Russia's military forces blasted Ukraine's capital region and other major cities Wednesday as they tried to crush a Ukrainian defense that has frustrated their progress nearly 3 weeks after invading. And while the two countries signaled some optimism for negotiations to end the war, Russia's ground advance on Kiev stalled. Despite the sustained bombardment, statements from the two sides suggested room for talks to make progress. Russian Foreign Ministry Sergei Lavrov said a neutral military status for Ukraine was being seriously discussed at the, quote, businesslike, end quote, talks, while Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky described Russia's demands for ending the war as becoming more realistic. Zelensky and Russian forces had been unable to move deeper into Ukrainian territory, but had continued their heavy shelling of cities, and Kiev residents huddled in their homes and shelters amid a citywide curfew that runs until Thursday morning as Russia rained shells on areas in and around the city. A 12-story apartment building in Kiev erupted in flames after being hit by shrapnel, one video report showed. Efforts are still needed. Patience is needed, Zelensky said in his nightly video address to the nation. Any war ends with an agreement. British and U.S. intelligence assessments supported the Ukrainian leader's view of the fighting, saying Russian ground forces remained about 9 miles from the city center of Kiev. And hopes for diplomatic progress rose after Zelensky said Tuesday that Ukraine realized it could not join NATO, his most explicit acknowledgement that the goal enshrined in Ukraine's constitution was unlikely to be met. Russian President Vladimir Putin has long depicted Ukraine's NATO aspirations as a threat to Russia, something Western military alliances deny. Now, it's interesting to see all these things continuing to develop, and we talk, and rightfully so, about where they are progressing to and the potential for them to lead to further outreach of the Russian military forces, and potentially this even leading to the Ezekiel 38 and 39 war scenario. And we'll talk about a couple of things here that make that a potential, if you will. American Military News reports that the U.S. has now deployed a Patriot missile system just 50 miles from the Ukraine border. A pair of U.S. Patriot missile defense systems, arrived in Poland on Tuesday and were installed at an airport located just 50 miles from its border with Ukraine, where Russian military forces are invading. The Daily Mail reported the missile defense systems were installed at the Rizal Jasionka International Airport in Rizal, Poland. And the city is located 50 miles from Poland's southeast border, about 100 miles from the southwest city of Lviv. The Patriot systems arrived at the Polish airport about a week after the U.S. European Command announced the U.S. would send two of its missile defense systems to Eastern North Atlantic Treaty Organization allies. The defensive employment is conducted proactively to counter any potential threat to U.S. and allied forces in NATO territory, EUCOM said last week. And Russian forces struck the Lviv area over the weekend, damaging a sprawling Ukrainian military base near the city of Yavoriv, western outskirt on Lviv. The Russian strikes reportedly landed as close to 10 miles from the Polish-Ukrainian border and killed as many as 35 people. So again, the concern about this spreading, moving into NATO nations, which would demand a NATO response. And NATO, remember, the U.S. is a member, and this would escalate things significantly, or at least be the cause for an escalation. Whether they would or not in this world, we don't know. But again, the Russian aggression against Ukraine is continuing to go somewhat unchecked, and the efforts of the world, the global community, is to sanction them and pressure them economically, and hopefully cause the people to rise up and stand against Putin and basically do away with his administration, as has been the efforts in Iran and other places around the world to simply sanction and pressure the pockets of people into acting against their own governments. Zarzim is reporting that foreign businesses in Russia are set to be nationalized. And this is a rather interesting development because many foreign countries are now leaving the Russian Federation in response to the Kremlin's invasion of Ukraine. Therefore, Russian President Vladimir Putin backed a government proposal Thursday that will impose external management on foreign companies that decide to leave Russia, reported Russian independent news outlet The Bell. The legislation in question was described by the ruling United Russia Party as the first step towards, get this, nationalizing foreign-owned organizations leaving the Russian market. Under the rules, there are two cases in which temporary administration can be imposed on a company of more than 25%. That more than 25% is owned by foreign individuals. The head or management of the company effectively ceases management. For example, by leaving the organization without oversight, company management takes decisions that could lead to an unjustified cessation of activities, liquidation, or bankruptcy. These include public announcements about the cessation of the company's activities in the absence of clear economic reasons. The first case, external administrators are appointed for 3 months, and the second for 6. In the second case, the process can be reversed. Shareholders who own more than 50% of the company can apply to the courts to remove the external administration and resume work in Russia or sell their stake to suitable new owners, in other words, Russians. The decision about whether to appoint external administrators will be taken by Moscow's arbitration court. So again, the nationalizing of internationally owned companies or foreign-owned companies, in this case in Russia, is basically an effort to stave off the economic collapse that Russia is facing, and Putin basically is operating as a dictator. This is not anything that we need to be turning a blind eye to. He does have aspirations, I believe, beyond simply Ukraine. He, like the Ayatollah in Iran and Erdogan in Turkey, envisions the return of Mother Russia, just as Erdogan envisions the return of the Ottoman Empire, and just as the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei envisions a global caliphate with Iran in charge, or Shia Islam, I should say. Now, here's where I think things are getting interesting. And this is something that has been kind of mentioned in multiple programs in the past. And now we're seeing it come up in the news. And this is very likely pointing to the hook in the jaw that could escalate this beyond the borders of Ukraine and move it out into the global arena. The Jewish News Syndicate is reporting that European dependence on gas produced by Russia revives a debate on the EastMed pipeline. Prior to the war in Ukraine, energy issues were judged by a single yardstick, their environmental impact. What the West is coming to realize is that energy is also about national security and deterrence, said Ikon Erdemir, a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Shocked by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and to rethinking its energy policy, The European Union's executive branch revealed on March 8th the outlines of a plan to wean the EU off Russian fossil fuels well before 2030. Israeli voices have called for the restarting of the EastMed pipeline, a project that would help achieve such goals by linking Israel's extensive offshore natural gas reserves with Europe, something Russia does not want and cannot afford. And again, this could be that hook in the jaw that draws Russia and the other invading nations down from the north. The EastMed, or the Eastern Mediterranean Pipeline Project, is a proposed 1,300-mile pipeline, 1,000 miles of which would be undersea. It would start at the Leviathan Basin to Europe, making landfall at Cyprus, Greece, and Italy. The Trump administration supported the project. The Biden administration did not, freezing the effort via a non-paper or unofficial document sent to Greece in January by the U.S. State Department, in which it expressed reservations about the pipeline's environmental impact and economic feasibility. Although the U.S. was not providing the funding, estimated at $7 billion, its political support was considered essential to go forward. Now, let me just pause here and ask the question, why? Who cares what the Biden administration says? You know, when you're basically trying to finance your own country and get heating oil and natural gas to your own country, this $7 billion is pennies. This country throws away $7 billion almost daily on garbage programs, gender equality studies in foreign countries, and all the things that we talked about last week, research projects that are just ridiculous and waste of money, and $7 billion to bolster the Israeli economy, $7 billion to feed the European continent with natural gas from the massive Leviathan gas field off the coast of Haifa. It just makes sense. It doesn't need political support from the Biden administration or anybody else for that matter to go forward. And hopefully this will push them to get this project back on track. The Ukraine war creates a new calculus, the article says. Prior to the outbreak of hostilities last month, Europe was moving towards still greater reliance on Russia with the recently completed and soon to be approved Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline from Russia to Germany, which was something that the Biden administration did approve. Now, according to its March 8th plan, the EU wants to reduce demand for Russian gas by 2/3 before the end of the year. I think the war has made it clear to everybody that the risks entailed for the West include continuing to depend on Russian gas. Dory Gold, president of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs and former Israeli ambassador to the UN, told the Jewish News Syndicate. Gold supports the resumption of the EastMed pipeline, noting in a March 13th article posted to his think tank's website that the Eastern Mediterranean has immense gas reserves, estimated to be roughly equivalent to 76 years of gas consumption by the EU. According to a 2015 study provided by Israel's Ministry of Energy, up to 26 billion barrels of oil and 7,734 billion cubic meters of gas are present in the Israeli-controlled area of the basin. It says that in addition to its proven discoveries, an additional 6.6 billion barrels of oil and 2,135, goodness sakes, I'm so sorry, 2,135 billion cubic meters of gas may yet be found. The long-term interests of your allies, they're writing numbers half in numerals, and then they switch to a word, and it's thrown me a curveball, just in case you're wondering why I can't read today. And under the plan, the gas that would be sent to Europe would come from areas controlled by Israel and Cyprus. A European Commission study on the pipeline's feasibility found that there are sufficient volumes of gas available even after the local needs are met. And the project would contribute to the enhancement of energy security, diversifying the supply sources for Europe, and to the reduction of the EU-wide consumers' gas bill. Creating a wrinkle in this untapped potential is a new development in which Israel has turned away from exploiting its gas reserves in favor of developing renewables. And again, this is where I think this thing has gotten so far off track. There's an article that stated here a few weeks ago that the European Union has based its exploration for its own energy needs on the counsel of Greta Thunberg. a teenage girl, which absolutely is ridiculous, and nothing but her tantrums on television about how uncaring the world is and how they aren't thinking about her and people of her age by their carelessness regarding the planet and energy resources. And again, this points back to the Isaiah 2 and 3 scenario where the Lord says that I will give the rebellious people, and in the last days, when during the time when the Lord is going to shake the earth, that He'll give them children for their leaders or their princes, is the word used there. And this again is just so bizarre for the tail to wag the dog the way it is in these last days. And listen, we have to remember Adam was put in the garden to tend the garden and keep it before man ever fell. So yes, of course, we should care for the planet we live on. Yes, we should, be aware of our climate and ecology and pay attention to those things. And of course, we shouldn't be dumping trash into the ocean and all those other things. But the reality is that God has stated that He's going to care for the planet, and the hydrologic cycle is going to continue as long as necessary. And someday that's in Genesis 8:22, by the way, there is going to be a new heaven and a new earth someday. And one pastor I heard use the phrase disposable planet. And I don't know if we want to get that cavalier about it, but I don't think we need to be destroying countries and economies and starving people and freezing them out to save Mother Earth. God has a better plan than that. And puny little man can't destroy what He created anyway. Now, another thing we need to understand that we're moving toward, and this article is interesting because it pairs two of the last days events together. That which we just spoke about, the energy element that creates the invasion of the Ezekiel war scenario. And it is both the invaders and the protesters that have the same thing in mind, and that is the plunder of Israel and their economic resources in the form of energy supply. And this story comes from Newsmax, and the headline reads, Senator Manchin, create superpower of the world with energy alliance. So again, this is coming to the forefront. The global energy needs are coming down to the center point of everything happening in the world. And Senator Joe Manchin on Wednesday called for a North American alliance on energy with the U.S., Canada, and Mexico to work as one energy hub that would create the superpower of the world in oil and gas. Let's look at the reality of the world we live in, the West Virginia Democrat said on a TV show called Morning Joe. Europe has made some decisions that weren't good for them. They're paying the price because of their dependency on dirty Russian oil and natural gas. Further, the hostilities in Ukraine are a war brought by President Vladimir Putin, who has weaponized energy, said Manchin. He used it against Europe. The least we can do is maintain our energy dependence and be able to backfill every way possible. We can do it with cleaner American energy. And this just popped in my head, so I have to mention it before I forget it. It's not in our lineup tonight. But we've heard, the King Newsom here in the state of California has been stating that by 2050, all vehicles in the state of California are going to be electric. There will be no more petroleum-based motorized vehicles in the state of California. And then just a few days ago, it was suggested that people with electric vehicles not charge them up right now because it's taxing the system. And it's the old proverbial, you can't make this stuff up. Such nonsense in our world today. Now back to our story. Environmentalists don't want to keep fossil fuels, but we can make sure we produce the cleanest resources basically from fossil, but be able to segue into a cleaner environment, Manchin insisted. This is logical, of course. We can do both. You can't do one and not the other, and I think we'll be fine. Further, the United States should be ramping up its oil and gas production, said Manchin, not only to regain the country's energy independence, but to help Europe. Excuse me. If we don't get Europe up and loaded for next year, for the summer when they have depleted all the reserves, there's going to be a big problem, said the senator. Meanwhile, the humanitarian crisis already being seen in Ukraine could spread through Europe if Russia decides to go further, said Manchin. And that means the U.S. must do more to be energy independent. In West Virginia, we've been trying to build a 42-inch pipeline, taking the abundant natural gas resources we have. That would bring 2 billion cubic feet a day into the market, said Manchin. It would help down in Louisiana. That would prevent a freeze up like we saw in Texas. These types of things we should be doing. As we bring cleaner energy online, you can re-sleeve those with different size pipes. The U.S. must also think of an all-in energy policy, but that means the government must be working as the partner for energy, not as an adversary, said the senator. Reliability is the name of the game, he added. For the superpower of the world, we should not be dependent on Iran or Venezuela to produce oil, the dirtiest oil in the world, when we can do it here in America. Manchin also on Wednesday defended his opposition to the nomination of Sarah Bloom Raskin to the Federal Reserve, who has since withdrawn as a candidate. And Biden accused the industry and conservative interest groups of staging baseless attacks against her, but Manchin disagreed. This was a 10-year appointment, said Manchin, noting that she backed cutting investments in fossil fuels. We don't have the technology to take up the void of what would happen if we walk away from fossil fuels, said Manchin. What we can do is produce fossil fuels much cleaner and bring renewables on board. Well, what that sounds like to me is a plan, not just simply an emotional save the planet, cut everything off, let's all go back to walking everywhere we go, or price people out of the market of being able to drive. And it's just insane the things that are going on in our world and the illogical decisions that are being made, basically to the demise of America's own people and the rest of the world as well. And, I think we have to understand that this is something that is pushing toward another element that we mentioned a moment ago. First of all, the energy aspect of what Manchin is talking about. But secondly, it's the call for a unification to be a superpower energy alliance. And this is telling us and reminding us, I believe, that the world is thinking this way. And while this may have been limited to North America, energy and the other elements, international tensions, the ethnic strife, all the other things that Jesus mentioned in Matthew 24, 3-8, are pushing the world towards a global type of thinking. We have to all get along. We have to share everything we have, this egalitarian mindset that is being pushed forward through the World Economic Forum and their idea of the Great Reset and all the other things that we've been hearing about for some time now, all have this same basis, that we have to get along. The world has to operate as a single unit, which is going to require a single governmental system. So while Manchin's motivations are certainly caring for us and avoiding financing people who are invading other countries, we also have to realize that there is something further behind that. And even if it's only the mentality of, we have to get to that place where everybody has enough fuel, everybody has enough food, and there can't be any competition for markets. There has to be just a global market. There has to be a global system of governance. And we are taking baby steps in that direction. But I will say this, just like a baby grows up, it starts to walk more confidently as it grows. And the steps are getting bigger, faster, and longer in these last days as the world moves towards the need for one man to rule over the whole world and control global commerce, which, of course, requires a mark on your right hand or forehead, identifying that you are a worshiper of that world leader, as evidenced in Revelation chapter 13. Now, let's talk about Iran for a few moments. The Jewish News Syndicate again reports that Iran exhibits its firepower capability as its confidence on the world stage grows. Now, why is its confidence growing? Its confidence is growing because there's a weak administration in the United States. And there's been a change in the Israeli administration as well. As a matter of fact, they bill themselves as the administration or the government of change. And not all change is good. And some change diminishes the elements of authority and the walk softly and carry a big stick type of mentality that has been protecting our nation and others for years, including Israel. And now Iran is exhibiting its firepower as their confidence in and on the world stage is growing. And there are multiple intended recipients for Iran's brinkmanship messaging, which is calculated to intimidate but not spark a full-scale war at this time. The 12 ballistic missiles fired from an Iranian base at Erbil in the northern Kurdish region of Iraq constituted a display of capabilities by the Islamic Republic, which were intended to intimidate but not to spark a war at this time. It's true to form. Iranian calculated brinkmanship. The missiles, fired from the Kermanshah region of Iran, covered some 400 or 340 kilometers or 215 miles, and were likely medium-range Fatah 110 ballistic missiles, according to an analyst at the Alma Center, an Israeli defense watchdog. If these missiles had landed in a crowded urban area, they would have caused considerable damage, noted Alma, stating that the missiles were likely precision-guided projectiles. The fact that these missiles carrying half-ton warheads didn't slam into populated areas is no coincidence. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps claimed that the missiles targeted a Mossad headquarters in Erbil, and the missiles hit an empty building not far from the American consulate in Erbil. A warning shot indeed. In taking this action, the Iranians exhibited their advanced precision-guided missile capabilities, trampled Iraq's sovereignty with immunity, and sent out warnings to multiple recipients. The first intended recipient appears to be Israel itself, which is threatened by the Fatah 110 ballistic missiles in the possession of Hezbollah in Lebanon. The message appears to come in response to the March 7th reported Israeli airstrike that Iran said killed 2 IRGC, Iranian Republican Guard Corps officers in Damascus. In deciphering the warning, Alma assessed that the messaging to Israel is that Iran will fire ballistic missiles directly at sites in Israel next time. A second target audience is likely the U.S. and the international community. Iran is visibly frustrated by the delay of the signature stage in the Vienna nuclear talks, which is a result of last-minute Russian maneuver to demand that it receives exemptions from sanctions placed on it and assurances that it can do business with Iran. The demand means that an agreement that has reached its final stage cannot yet be signed, and painful American sanctions said that the Iranians believe would soon be lifted remain unless either Russia changes its position or the U.S. finds a new way to sign the agreement without Russia, which is easier said than done due to Russia's key role in the intended agreement, which includes importing excess Iranian uranium and overseeing the conversion of the Fordow nuclear site into a research center. The Russians want to oversee a nuclear site in Iran. And of course, we know these two groups are going to play lead roles in the invasion of Israel. Now, the Jerusalem Post is reporting that Iran has 3,000 ballistic missiles. Many can reach Israel, according to U.S. General. Iran has more than 3,000 ballistic missiles, many of which can reach the state of Israel, commander of the U.S. Central Command, General Kenneth McKenzie, said on Tuesday. At a military level, my concern is, first of all, that they do not have a nuclear weapon, but I am also very concerned about the remarkable growth and efficiency of their ballistic missile program, McKenzie told the Senate Armed Services Committee. They have over 3,000 missiles of various types, some of which can reach Tel Aviv, McKenzie said, in a response to a query by the Senate committee. None of them can reach Europe yet. In McKenzie's written statement, he called Iran's missile force the greatest threat to the region's security and that Iran has developed an arsenal of nuclear warhead-capable ballistic missiles and has tested these weapon platforms multiple times. He told the committee that over the last 5 to 7 years, Iran has invested heavily in its ballistic missile program, and the U.S. CENTCOM assessed in a pre-written statement that Syria and Iraq will continue to be used as supply routes and hubs to forward its campaign against Israel. This is in part to arm its proxy in Lebanon, Hezbollah. It was estimated last year that Hezbollah has 130,000 to 150,000 rockets that can reach deep into Israeli territory, and this arms stockpile includes Iranian ballistic missiles, just as we mentioned a moment ago. So, this underscores the fact that, as my brother Amir Sarfati often points out, that the Bible's record of the last days, it records international events taking place, but they're all in relation to the nation of Israel. And that's where all this is headed. It's all headed to little bitty Israel. A country so small on a world flat map, you have to write their name out in the Mediterranean Ocean, no bigger than the state of New Jersey, some 8,000 square miles. And this is the center of world attention, just like Zechariah said it was going to be in chapter 12. The nations of the world are going to gather against Jerusalem. And this is going to be spearheaded by the Ezekiel invasion, which I believe is a response to the fulfillment of the Isaiah 17:1 unfulfilled prophecy that Damascus will become a ruinous heap. And we see continual forays, if you will, or sorties of Israeli military products, air products into Damascus to deal with some imported weaponry that came from Iran, basically to change the proximity of their relationship to Israel and allow them to get deeper and deeper into Israeli territory and have their basically launch place be rather than from Iran to be from the Golan. The Syrian Golan, I should say. Now, here's what's troubling to me as an American, and I hope it's something that we all pray against. And just to, again, the lunacy that we see today is just, it's startling and troubling to be sure. But the Associated French Press is reporting, U.S. says remaining issues with Iran on nuke deal can be resolved. So here we are with Iran showing their strength, firing missiles as a warning, brinkmanship, as the article said, to Israel and the U.S. And what does the U.S. say? And besides the fact that the Russians are at the mediation table, or the negotiating table in Vienna with the Iranians while they're invading another country, basically invading not just their sovereignty, but killing innocent citizens and doing so under the guise of self-protection and all these other things. And yet here they are sitting at a table wanting to oversee a nuclear plant and transition it into a research facility in Iran. And yet the U.S. is still sitting down, still trying to reach an agreement with the very people, or I should say the administration. Let me just pause here for a moment. Now, the Iranian people are wonderful people. They care about the same things we care about. They want to have jobs. They want to raise their families. They don't agree with their administration. And basically, they've been hijacked by an ideology and the associated religion that the ideology is birthed from. And most Iranian people don't want to see the position they now have to be the position that they have in the international community. They want to play a part in this world, and they are not who we're talking about when we speak about the Iranians. We're talking about the Ayatollah and his regime of terror, who is bent on not just financing or being the world's largest financer of terror, but also, to make no bones about it, that they want to see the destruction of the great Satan, the United States, and the little Satan, Israel. And yet, this administration, from a deal that was walked away from because it was ridiculous by the previous administration, this administration immediately, in its first year in office, wants to go and sit back down at the table with the same country that has violated all the terms of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and have continued to move towards a weapons-grade enrichment of uranium with no pause, and just basically saying and telling people foolish enough to believe them that their aspirations or nuclear aspirations are peaceful, and it's about energy. The United States and Iran, the article says, are still nearing an agreement over reviving the 2015 deal on limiting Tehran's nuclear weapons program. The State Department said on Wednesday, "We're close to a possible deal, but we're not there yet," said State Department spokesman Ned Price. "We do think, however, the remaining issues can be bridged." Well, the issue is the regime in Iran, and unless that's gone, it can't be bridged. The Associated Press is reporting that the war in Ukraine disrupts key supply chains and lives. And again, I think it's important for us to understand how many things are happening in this world that are pointing to what's going to be fulfilled during the tribulation period. We know that there's going to be a massive famine under the riders of the four horses of the apocalypse. And we've talked about these things many times, but, what is going to cause these things? What is going to contribute to them seems to be possibly happening in the opening stages of such a time we're experiencing right now. We're all talking about the shortages, and look at what has happened to fuel prices here in the States. There's places around where here in I know, Hawaii and other places have experienced these astronomical prices. But for us here in the contiguous United States, it's unusual to see $7 and $8 per gallon fuel prices. And yet here we are. And it's all because of something that is happening on the other side of the world. And therefore, these things are linked together. And the COVID issue with the supply chain issue is now or continuing to manifest itself and causing shortages in certain products. And it was funny. I went through Costco the other day, and I know that because for whatever reason, when COVID first hit, everybody decided we better have a year's supply of toilet paper and paper towels, and they were out. And it continued, and shortages of TP and paper towels. And the other day, I walked through Costco, and there were more toilet paper rolls and paper towels than you could count. They were shoved down side aisles and all over the place. Who knows what was in the back room? And the same section that normally they store the water at was like a third of what it used to be because of all the toilet paper and paper towels. So they ordered according to the crisis, and now these shipments have arrived. And people evidently have returned to thinking, maybe I don't need 1,000 rolls of toilet paper after all. But supply chain issues are here and clear. And the AP reports that it can be hard to measure the ways that Russia's war in Ukraine has disrupted the global supply of parts and raw materials needed to complete a variety of products, from cars to computer chips. But cutting off one of those supply links brought a depressing feeling to Andrew Bibic, head of the Interpipe steel plant in Dnipro, Ukraine. He spent the first hours of the war winding down his bustling 24-hour operation and sending almost everyone home. It's empty and lonely. You don't hear a sound. Everything is frozen, he said. Getting Interpipe steel transmission pipes to Texas oil companies and its railway wheels to European high-speed train operators has been put on hold. Hundreds of the plant's roughly 10,000 employees have joined the fight against Russia. Others have fled. A remaining skeleton crew runs its canteens and makes spiky metal obstacles to block Russian tanks and convoys. Its bomb shelters house dozens of local families at night. It's a hard choice to stop production. We had plenty of orders. A lot of customers awaiting our material, but if you have to choose between safety and profits, I think the answer is obvious, said Bibic, who's worked at the company for nearly 2 decades. The most important thing we have is life, and we need to take care of the people we love. And similar production halts have spread across other industries in Ukraine, motivated not just by safety concerns, but also because the war and mass exodus of refugees have closed off roads and railways to commercial freight traffic. Some of Interpipe's finished products bound for overseas export are now stalled at the Black Sea port of Odessa. Ukraine accounts for only about 3% of the world's exports, while Russia's share is about 1.9%, according to Russia by the Dutch bank ING. Still, some industries doing business with these nations are starting to feel the war's impact. For Russia, a key producer of energy, steel, and raw metals, such as nickel, copper, platinum, and palladium, many of which are important to the auto industry, the supply concerns are tied to punishing Western economic sanctions and Russia's move to retaliate against them. For Ukraine, the war itself is cutting off supplies. We want to give priority to the refugees, people trying to move out of the war zone, and humanitarian and military convoys, said Interpipe's Houston-based chairman, former CEO Fadi Harabi. The disruption of another Ukrainian industry and the making of wiring harnesses used in cars is already hurting European automakers. And Ukraine has more than 30 automotive plants, most of them centered near the western border with Poland and other European neighbors, according to the government agency that promotes foreign investment. German parts supplier Leoni said production has been interrupted at its 2 western Ukraine plants in Styria and Kolomyja, and that it's looking for temporary alternatives. We are aware that this situation is currently affecting not only Leoni, but the entire industry, according to Gregor Leclerc, the spokesman for this group. Now, this is nothing to say without mentioning, I should say, the fact that this is the breadbasket of Europe. Between Russia and Ukraine, there's a massive percentage, some 40% of the wheat and grain and barley supplied into the European markets that's being interrupted as well, which reminds us that there is going to be a famine during the tribulation of such a great magnitude that it's going to cost a day's pay for a quart of wheat or barley, which is basically a loaf of bread or one day's meal or one meal for the day, I should say. So, are these things contributing to it? Well, if they're not, they're telling us how they could happen and that they will happen someday. And here you've got this global supply system that's being cut off. You've got the energy being used as a weapon against different markets to force people into buying products that finance war. And all these things are just moving the world mentally and emotionally and to a degree spiritually to that place where it's going to be prepared for one man to rise and say, let's do it this way and I'll take control. Fox News says House Dems want Biden to declare a national climate emergency and ban oil drilling on federal land. So here we are paying $7 and $8. I think the average price in the country now is $4. Now, granted, that's not true here in California because we've got over $1 in taxes and all kinds of other things attached to every gallon of gas sold. But our prices here thankfully aren't for the whole of the nation, but they are moving up incrementally the same across the country, the same percentage increase, whether it's $3 initially or $5 initially, they're still growing and still impacting pockets. So what do the House Democrats want to do? Declare a climate emergency and ban oil drilling on federal lands. Progressive Democrats in the House of Representatives reportedly planning to publicly urge President Biden to prevent or ban oil drilling on federal lands amid record gas prices and a war in Ukraine that has disrupted oil markets. According to a report from Politico, the Congressional Progressive Caucus is planning to demand that Biden use his executive power to declare climate change an emergency and ban drilling on federal lands. The request, now think about this, climate change. How does drilling for oil affect the climate? I mean, you look at the state of California, and I mentioned this before, but emissions has been a big deal here in California. I remember there were days when I was growing up in elementary school many, many years ago where we would have smog alerts and you couldn't go outside for recess and you could see it and you could taste it. It hurt your lungs. But we made substantial progress here in California in that regard in cleaning up the air. And I haven't heard of a smog alert in a long, long time here in the States. But, you look at what's going on with the oil markets around the world. And, to say that drilling for oil is going to cause the climate to change is just beyond ridiculous. It's insulting to human intelligence. And yet here, this progressive Democrat group is pushing this under the banner of climate change and supplying oil to our country. And sure, it's going to throw some stuff up in the air. There's no question about that. We need to be able to take care of that. And again, that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying we be careless, but what I am saying is that we don't allow these extremists to run this country and to push things like this through. But that's the mentality today. Democrats wonder why people blame them for high gas prices. A Twitter account associated with the National Republican Congressional Committee tweeted, Americans are experiencing the highest gas prices since the 2008 financial crisis, with the national gas price average reaching over $4 a gallon. We need to focus on building critical infrastructure and increasing domestic production, not jeopardizing North American energy security, said President and CEO of the National Association of Manufacturers, Jay Timmons. Manufacturers oppose this attempt to potentially further disrupt domestic energy production and drive up prices. We do know that on the first day of his administration, I believe it was the first day, that the new president, basically banned or shut down the Keystone pipeline project. The use of climate emergency also raises constitutional concerns as the nation eases out of emergency COVID restrictions imposed 2 years ago by governors and local authorities. And by the way, the Democratic legislation here in California just voted to extend King Newsom's emergency authority, even though restrictions are being lifted all over the country. And, lots of stories about new variants. And, there's been some people in the medical community have been crying out and been ostracized. And, variants are basically mutations of viruses, and mutations downgrade. They can downgrade into a form that has components in its structure that lead to it being more contagious, like the Omicron. It was more contagious, but it was less threatening or less lethal, so to speak. But we're just hearing these things over and over and over, and the whole thing is about a power grab. We have to hang on to power, like we see here in California. The Algerminer is reporting that U.S. Jewish lawmakers press Amnesty International over the denial of Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. A group of 10 Jewish members of the U.S. House of Representatives sent an open letter on Wednesday to the Secretary General of Amnesty International denouncing comments by the head of the NGO's, non-government organization's U.S. branch, that rejected Israel's right to exist, which the lawmakers described as symptomatic of Amnesty's hostile attitude toward Israel. Amnesty International cannot credibly advance human rights around the globe while simultaneously denying the only Jewish state their right to self-determination, the letter said. Amnesty International's USA Executive Director Paul O'Brien said at an event last Wednesday that the group was opposed to the idea that Israel should be preserved as a state for the Jewish people, as reported by the Jewish Insider. Despite survey results to the contrary, O'Brien argued he felt most American Jews merely wanted Israel to serve as a sanctuary for Jewish people, not a Jewish state. The comments rekindled criticism of Amnesty International, which in a February report accused Israel of practicing apartheid and an explicit policy of establishing and maintaining a Jewish demographic hegemony since its founding in 1948. That is anti-Semitism at its worst. And listen, if you've been supporting Amnesty International, please stop. That is anti-Semitic. And there's lots of organizations that are supportive of Israel. And we as Christians especially need to be supportive of Israel as God has brought them back into the land for the purpose of finishing their discipline in the 70th week of Daniel. And through that discipline and the wrath he pours out on the world, bringing a third of the Jews to salvation, remembering what's recorded in Zechariah chapters 12 to 14, that sadly 2/3 of the Jews will die during the tribulation, but a third of them are going to come to the place at the second coming where they look upon the one whom they pierced and mourn for him as one mourns for an only son. God's not done with Israel, and we need to be standing beside her as well. Now, that doesn't mean we agree with everything they say and do and just give them carte blanche or, turn a blind eye to anything that may be in error. But we do look at it with biblical lenses and understand that they have a role in these last days. Christian Headlines reports that Colorado passes controversial bill declaring that a fetus does not have independent rights, even though it's got its own DNA, even though it's got its own chromosomal signature. The bill, known as by supporters as the Reproductive Health Quality Act, or HB 1279, declares abortion a fundamental right and notes that the U.S. Supreme Court could overturn Roe v. Wade in the coming months. It passed the State House on Tuesday, 40-24. Pro-life activists call the bill radical and say it would roll back common-sense pro-life laws, such as parental notification requirements for teens and girls. The bill, if passed and signed into law, could make Colorado the most radical abortion state in the country, the Colorado Catholic Conference said. The language of the bill itself has sparked controversy. A fertilized egg, embryo, or fetus does not have independent or derivative rights under the laws of this state, the bill says. It further states that a pregnant individual has a fundamental right to continue a pregnancy and give birth or to have an abortion and to make decisions about how to exercise that right. Government shall not deny, restrict, interfere with, or discriminate against an individual's right to have an abortion, the bill says. The Colorado Catholic Conference says the bill would allow on-demand abortion for the full 40 weeks of pregnancy and allow abortion discrimination based on sex, race, or disability. It could also prohibit regulation of abortion based on the health of a woman or her baby, the conference says. HB 1279 violates the fundamental human right to life for millions of preborn children, the conference said. It is out of touch with the desires of millions of Colorado voters. We must show Colorado lawmakers that they legislate on behalf of the people, and the people of Colorado do not want to live in the most radical abortion state in the country, the Catholic Conference said. Now, again, just thinking about the degradation of human morality and spirituality that comes along with that, or is actually the cause of it, that we see happening in our world today tells us that we are on the cusp of the thinking that is going to be predominant during the tribulation. That those are enemies of the Antichrist. We should just kill them, and we'll be a better world without them. And that's exactly what's going to happen during the tribulation period. If you don't take the mark, which the mark means you are a worshiper of the beast, that you have sided with Satan against God, because that's what Revelation 13 says. They worship the dragon. The dragon is Satan. So if you take the mark, you worship the devil. And if you worship the devil, that's why receiving the mark means that you have determined your eternal destiny and sealed it, because you have sided with the devil against God. And this type of thinking is going on in our world today, and it is fed by and feeds things like we just read. That a human child inside the mother's womb, which left alone, is going to produce a baby, and it's a baby at conception. I believe, and the Bible teaches clearly that those are children inside the womb of a mother, and not just fetal tissue without any human identity, as this bill says. But it just tells us how far the depravity of man has reached, and that the world is ripe for going in to the Great Tribulation. And by the way, I'll remind you, as I do every week, the Great Escape precedes the Great Tribulation. And that ought to do two things in us. One, it ought to motivate us to tell people about Jesus. And secondly, it ought to remind us that all of these things that we read about in the book of Revelation from chapter 6 to 19 will have no part in, except in chapter 19, verses 11 to 16, when we come back with Jesus. So look up. Our redemption of these bodies is nigh. The Daily Wire says USA Today names Women of the Year. One of them is Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services, Rachel Levine, a biological man. Every day across our country, USA Today's Women of the Year lead and inspire, promote, and fight for equity and give others a place to seek help and find hope. They are strong and resilient women who have been champions of change and courage, often quietly but with powerful results, and often despite their own challenges. Some of the women may be familiar names, others may be new to you. Each has an inspiring and powerful story of Levine. USA Today noted Levine, 64, a trained pediatrician, became the nation's highest-ranking openly transgender official last March when the Senate confirmed her as Assistant Secretary of Health. Levine told the USA Today, "I really feel that everything I've ever done, whether it's in academic medicine or in education and clinical research, seeing my patients and my role in public health in Pennsylvania and now my role nationally, has all led to this moment in terms of helping the nation through this greatest public health crisis that we have faced in over 100 years. Beyond the pandemic," Levine said he is concerned about the challenges women and girls face today related to body image. And Levine told the outlet, "We need to be welcoming and celebratory for women of all aspects, shapes, and sizes. And we have to work towards that compassion for all women and not put such an emphasis on thinness and appearance. I think we need to work as a culture in the U.S., but also globally, to be more compassionate, more accepting of girls and women's, no matter what their size and shape. Women are absolutely critical in terms of promoting healthy behaviors for themselves and families and our communities. I think women are creators of change." Well, he is. He claims to have changed his sex. I think women are those change makers. But again, this is just beyond ridiculous and devastating, really, to even read that such a person who sees themselves as the opposite of what their biological signature tells them that they are and cannot change has been placed in a national office, a high-ranking one with some 6,400 people under his command, is a man who dresses like a woman and says he's a woman. And I'll just throw this out there. It's no wonder he comments about the size and shape, because he's a pretty rough-looking character, I have to say. But again, it tells us about the moral condition of our world today and all that we see going on that leads to the mindset in the tribulation period. Now, here's our last story for today, and I just had to throw this in just because it's just so incredibly bizarre, and but it does have, I think, some implications prophetically. This comes from a journal called Study Finds. Scientists discover how to create shape shifting robots. Terminator fans, look away. Scientists say they have discovered how to create shape shifting robots, and let's just hope they're friendly. The article opens up. The new study by physicists at University of Bath found a way to coat soft robots in materials which would allow them to move and change to fit specific needs. This breakthrough in the creation of what researchers call active matter could forever change the way humans build machines. To better describe their invention, study authors say the surface of an ordinary soft material always changes back into a sphere. It's like how a droplet of water always shapes itself in a round bead, creating the smallest surface area possible. Active matter, on the other hand, works against this tendency. For example, scientists can wrap a rubber ball in a layer of nanorobots programmed to work together to reform the ball into the shape of a star. And researchers believe that active matter will lead to the creation of machines whose functions come from the bottom up. More specifically, these robots would contain multiple active units that work together to determine the shape, movements, and functions that best complete certain tasks. This is much different from today's generation of machines, which get their programming from a central controller, like a robotic arm in a factory. Therefore, active matter robots would function much in the same way human tissues do that control the organs in our bodies. What jobs could shape shifting robots do? The researchers say one thing these machines might be useful for is serving as a new generation of drug delivery capsules. By coating the surface of nanoparticles with active matter, these robots might be able to improve the way drugs interact with cells in the body and deliver medicine to certain areas of the body. Active matter, excuse me, makes us look at the familiar rules of nature. Rules like the fact that the surface tension has to be positive in a new light. Seeing what happens if we break these rules and how we can harness the results is an exciting place to be doing research, says the author studied Jake Binyish in a university release. The study is an important proof of concept that has many useful implications. For instance, future technology could produce soft robots that are far squishier and better at picking up and manipulating delicate materials, adds corresponding author Dr. Anton Suslov. During their experiments with a 3D soft solid experiencing active stress, the team found these stresses expand the material's surface, causing it to change shape. Study authors also discovered that the shape the solid formed could be tailored by altering materials' elastic properties, and the team is now designing specific robots, including soft arms and swimming robots, to examine how this principle works under real world conditions. This was a published article in the Journal of Science Advances. So let's see how we can violate the rules of nature. And again, I just thought this was an interesting story to talk about the advancement of humanity. We know that during the tribulation period, there is going to be life given to an image that was created by man, built by man, and much like I believe it's Isaiah 46, the mockery of the one who cuts down a tree, builds a fire with one half and makes a god into the other and falls down before it and says, "You are my God who has made me," and worships it. So too is this going to happen during the tribulation, where man is going to build an image, and then the beast is going to give life to that image, the second beast that is, and man is going to fall down and worship what he has made. And, the advancements of science are wonderful and we all benefit from them daily. But there is, I think, an edge that we are reaching to where now science is trying to play God in a lot of ways. And very, very interesting to read that we are in such a place today. So that's it for today. And I hope you found these things encouraging and enlightening, and realizing that we indeed are closing in on that moment and twinkling of an eye experience. And, we've seen these things move forward and back. I remember back in 1991 in the Persian Gulf War, boy, churches were packed. Why? There was a conflict in the Middle East. And I remember thinking at the time, if this doesn't go anywhere, there's going to be an indifference in the future to further escalations in the Middle East. And here we are. Here we've got things that basically the prophetic engine is running on all cylinders. Everything is advancing. Everything is moving forward. And yet we see fewer and fewer people, even in the church, having any interest in Bible prophecy. And it is becoming, or I should say it has become, as it was in the days of Noah. Now, let me remind you about the days of Noah. I've always found this to be interesting. Noah, we're told, was a preacher of righteousness. He and his family built a boat on a planet where it had never rained. Genesis tells us that the vapor went up from the earth and watered it. And it wasn't until the fountains of the deep and the heavens opened at the time of the flood that rain had come. So here you've got a man and his family building a boat on dry land on a planet where it had never rained, preaching righteousness and impending judgment, which is part of it. And how many people got on the boat? 8 people. And Jesus said, that's going to be the same mentality of the last days. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now. So listen, don't be discouraged. And, as it's been said, and I've repeated it, and it's all over social media, normal isn't coming back, but Jesus is. And he is going to come back, and we are going to meet him in the air. And, let me just throw this out there as it just popped in my head because somebody asked me about this on Sunday. We've all, heard, and many pastors have said, if we knew who that last person was to be saved, that we would all be out there sharing the gospel so we can get out of here, sharing the gospel with them so we can get out of here. And that's not how it works. People are going to get saved during the tribulation. A massive number of people are going to get saved during the tribulation. So we're not looking for the last person to be saved. What we're waiting for is a day and an hour. That's what the Bible has made very clear. There is a predetermined day and hour where the church is going to be raptured. And then sometime after that, not immediately, but sometime after that, the tribulation is going to begin. So listen, we're not waiting for the last person to be saved. There is the fulfillment of the whole world hearing the gospel that happens during the tribulation, but it's not by human preaching. It's by an angel flying in the midheaven or the high point in the sky, preaching the everlasting gospel. And that's when that's going to be fulfilled. So listen, we really don't have anything to wait for other than a tick of the clock at a time which is known by God that we don't know. We don't know the day or the hour, but it's going to come. And all of a sudden, just like that, in the moment and twinkling of an eye, we're going to be forever with the Lord, having put on a glorified Christ-like body, which is what we have been ordained to do. So keep looking up. Don't be discouraged in these days, even as many of these stories are head shakers, and it's just hard to imagine a world that is just so deceived and so delusional and so evil. And that ought to remind us about the fact that we're going to be taken out of here before God judges the earth. So with that said, that's all for this week. And I encourage you to keep your eyes on the prize. Tell people about Jesus this week. And if we don't see you next week, we'll see you here, there, or in the air. God bless you.